Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. The first sound I ever heard was the aggressive buzz of a hospital fluorescent light. Until that moment, my reality had been defined by vibrations, shadows, and the silent language of hands. I was born deaf, and for me, sound was an abstract concept, something I only understood through the descriptions of others. But science promised miracles, and I was one of its guinea pigs. I underwent an experimental surgery, a cutting-edge cochlear implant designed to connect my brain to a universe that had been denied to me. The day they activated the implant was a violent rebirth. That initial buzzing drilled through my skull like a power tool. The doctors spoke to me, but their voices were a cacophony of meaningless noise. I went out onto the street and the world assaulted me. The roar of traffic, the murmur of people, the screech of brakes. It was a bombardment, a chaos of frequencies my brain didn't know how to interpret. The first few days in my apartment were equal parts torture and wonder. I discovered the constant hum of my refrigerator, the rhythmic drip of the kitchen faucet, the creak of the floorboards under my own feet. These were sounds that normal people ignored, but for me they were an overwhelming symphony. I would spend hours sitting on the floor, eyes closed, trying to isolate each sound, trying to give it a name, a place. I was learning to hear, a child in an adult's body. It was during one of these listening sessions, in the stillness of the night, that I first perceived it. It was a different kind of sound. Not the hum of an appliance or the murmur of the distant city. It was a whisper, a woman's voice, incredibly faint, almost lost in the background static of my new hearing. At first, I dismissed it. My doctor had warned me about auditory hallucinations. My brain, he explained, would try to fill the gaps, invent sounds as it got used to its new sense. It was normal, ghosts in the machine. I gave it no importance, but the whisper returned, always at night, always in the silence. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from the bedroom wall. Other times it seemed to be right behind me. It was never clear. They were fragments of words, meaningless syllables that dissolved in the air as soon as I tried to focus on them. But there was an emotion in that voice. An emotion that my brain, despite being new to the world of sound, recognized instantly. Deep pain. I started to feel uneasy in my own apartment. The solitude, which had once been a quiet and peaceful companion, had become expectant. I felt I wasn't alone, that I shared my silence with an echo that refused to fade. One night, the whisper became clearer. I was in bed, about to fall asleep. And then I heard it, distinctly, as if someone were kneeling beside my pillow. "You can't," the woman's voice said, a voice broken by sorrow. I shot up, my heart racing. I turned on the light. The room was empty, but the air was freezing. I approached the wall the sound seemed to come from, the one adjoining the next apartment, and pressed my ear against it. I heard nothing, only the silence of the night. The phenomena stopped being purely auditory. One afternoon, while reading in the living room, the book I was holding was snatched from my hands by an invisible force and thrown across the room. It hit the wall with a dull thud. I stared at the book on the floor, then at my empty hands. This wasn't my brain. This wasn't a hallucination. Fear began to take root in me. I started researching the building's history. It was an old construction from the early 20th century. In the city archives, I found a series of newspaper clippings from about 5 years ago. They talked about the previous tenant of my apartment, a young woman. The first articles mentioned her disappearance, the last ones, her discovery. They found her in the apartment. The official version was suicide, but the article mentioned strange details, hints that the scene was more violent than it should have been. The connection was obvious. terrifying. The ghost of the woman who had died here. But why could I hear her? The answer was as logical as it was insane. My implant. It wasn't just picking up the frequencies of the physical world. For some reason, it was tuned into something else, to the echo of the suffering that had soaked into these walls. Once I knew the truth, the present seemed to realize it. It stopped hiding. The whispers turned into an angry, one-sided conversation. It accused me. It blamed me. It screamed at me. I heard her laments in the shower, her sobs in the kitchen. The voice was filled with a resentment so deep, so corrosive, it seemed to poison the air. And then, I started to see her. The first time was a flash. I was in the hallway, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw a pale figure in the bedroom doorway. When I turned, there was nothing. The second time was clearer. I woke up in the middle of the night, feeling an icy cold, and standing at the foot of my bed was her. She was a young woman, dark hair stuck to her face, clothes in tatters. Her skin was a translucent white, almost bluish. But the worst part was her eyes. They were two pits of fury, a fury not of this world. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking through me, as if she were reliving the moment of her death over and over. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I only felt a wave of cold and pure hatred that paralyzed me completely. And then, she vanished. The apartment had become a hell. I barely slept. I barely ate. The constant sound of her anger and the terror of her appearances were breaking me. I considered turning off the implant, returning to my world of silence, but now, silence terrified me more than the noise, because I knew what was hiding in it. One night the entity changed tactics. The hatred ceased, and in its place I heard pleas. "Help me," the voice whispered. "He hurt me. You have to help me." Her voice was filled with a vulnerability that broke my heart. She told me fragments of her story, of a love that had turned violent, of a terrible end in this very room. For the first time I felt empathy for her, pity. I believed she was just seeking justice, peace. She asked me to do something, to find something he had taken from her. A small silver locket. She said it was hidden somewhere in the apartment, that without it, she couldn't rest. It was her anchor to this world, she told me. If I found it and buried it far away from here, she could leave. The idea of helping her, of ending my torment and giving her the peace she sought, was too great a temptation. I started searching. For days I scoured every corner of the apartment. I looked behind baseboards, under loose floorboards, in the backs of closets. I was about to give up when I found it. It was in the only place I hadn't looked. Inside the tank of the old toilet in the bathroom, it was a silver locket blackened by time. It was cold to the touch. I felt a wave of triumph and relief. I had found it. It was about to be over. I held the locket in my hand. "Thank you," the voice whispered in my head, sounding calm now, almost happy. "Now destroy it." I frowned. "Destroy it? But you told me to bury it." Her silence was the only answer. And then, a cold laugh, a laugh that had nothing to do with the pleading voice I had been hearing, echoed in the room. It was a triumphant, malevolent laugh. "You heard me?" the voice said, loud now, authoritative. "Destroy it. Free me." The locket in my hand began to warm up, to vibrate. And I understood my terrible mistake. It wasn't her anchor. It was her cage. And I, in my stupidity, had just picked the lock. The locket vibrated in my hand with a malignant energy, a small metal cage containing a hurricane of resentment. The woman's laughter echoed in the room, not as a sound traveling through the air, but as a frequency generated directly inside my skull. It was laughter stripped of any sorrow, a pure sound of triumph and cruelty. I had fallen into her trap. The hunter had pretended to be the prey, and I, the well-intentioned savior, was the key about to set it free. My first impulse was to throw the locket, to get rid of it, but an icy intuition stopped me. If I destroyed it, I would free her. If I threw it away, she would find a way to torment me until I retrieved it and opened it. The only option was to return it to its prison of water and silence. With the entity's laughter still ringing in my mind, I turned toward the toilet. But before I could move, the bathroom door slammed shut with a violence that shook the walls. The sound of the bolt sliding, a metallic final click, echoed in the small space. I was trapped. The light bulb overhead flickered erratically and then burst, plunging me into near-total darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the streetlight filtering through the small frosted window. The locket in my hand stopped vibrating. Instead, it began to emanate a cold so intense it burned my skin. I dropped it. It landed on the tile floor with a dull clink. "You'll regret this," the voice whispered, now stripped of any false trace of vulnerability. It was a cold, sharp voice, filled with a predatory patience. The water in the toilet began to bubble. A foul smell of stagnant water and decay filled the air. The water turned dark, almost black, and shapes began to rise from it, drowned faces writhing in silent agony before sinking back down. I scrambled to the farthest corner, away from the hellish vision, my back pressed against the cold tiles. The medicine cabinet mirror in front of me began to fog up, not from steam, but from an icy mist that seemed to emanate from its own surface. And on the glass, as if an invisible finger were writing, a word appeared. Mine. Terror gave me strength I didn't know I had. I stood up and threw myself against the door, hitting it with my shoulder again and again. The old wood groaned but didn't give. The laughter returned to my head, mocking my futile efforts. After several minutes of desperate struggle, the door suddenly flew inward, throwing me onto the hallway floor. I scrambled to my feet, breathless, and looked around. The apartment had been transformed. All the furniture was overturned. Books had been ripped from the shelves, their pages scattered across the floor like dead leaves. The pictures on the walls hung crooked or lay shattered on the ground. It was a scene of silent, methodical violence. I knew I couldn't stay there. My home had become her territory, but I couldn't leave without the locket. Leaving it behind was leaving her the key to her own cage. I went back into the dark bathroom. I fumbled on the floor. My fingers brushed against the icy metal. I grabbed it and ran. I ran toward the apartment's front door. But as I reached it, I stopped dead. The door was wide open, and in the threshold, her back to me, stood the figure of the woman. She was more solid than ever, less translucent. I could see the detail of her tattered clothes, the dark knot of her tangled hair. She turned slowly. Her face was no longer that of a sad victim. Her eyes burned with a black light, and a twisted, cruel smile played on her pale lips. "You're not going anywhere," her voice echoed in my mind. She took a step toward me, and the objects in the house came alive. The shards of glass from the broken picture frames rose from the floor and flew at me like a swarm of razors. I covered my face with my arms, feeling the sharp cuts on my skin. A kitchen knife shot out from its wooden block and embedded itself in the wall, inches from my head. I stumbled backward and locked myself in the bedroom, the only room that seemed relatively calm. I blocked the door with the bed. I was trapped again, but at least I had a moment to think. I sat on the floor, my back against the door, and examined the locket. The woman's furious whispering had started up on the other side of the door. It was a cage, but how did it work? I looked for a clasp, a mechanism. On the edge, almost invisible, I found a tiny latch. With my fingernail, I managed to open it. The locket clicked open. Inside wasn't what I expected. There was no portrait of her. On one side was a small black and white photograph of a kind-looking man, smiling. But his eyes had been furiously scratched out with black ink. On the other side, behind a small protective glass, there wasn't a lock of hair. There was a piece of paper, tiny, folded several times. With extreme care, using the tip of my pocket knife, I took out the tiny piece of paper. I unfolded it. It was a newspaper clipping yellowed with time. It contained only a few lines of text. Police continue to search for Daniel Miller, missing for a week. His partner, the last person to see him, claims he left after an argument. My blood ran cold. Daniel. That wasn't the name she had told me. She had spoken of an abuser named Marcos. She had lied. I searched the name, Daniel Miller, on my phone, which miraculously still worked. The story popped up instantly. It was a cold case from 5 years ago. A man who disappeared without a trace. His partner, the woman from my apartment, had been the prime suspect, but they never found enough evidence. She died a year after Daniel's disappearance. The official cause was suicide, but the report mentioned she had died in a strange way, as if she had drowned in her own rage. The truth, a monstrous truth, hit me with the force of a revelation. The ghost wasn't the victim. She was the killer. She hadn't been tormented. She was the torment. Daniel hadn't left her. She had made him disappear. And the locket, her cage, didn't contain her sorrow. It contained her crime. The instant I understood the truth, the pounding on my bedroom door ceased. A deep, heavy silence fell over the apartment, and the voice in my head spoke again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper or a scream. It was a cold, calm statement. Now you know. The bedroom door began to vibrate. The wood groaned, warping inward, as if immense pressure was being applied from the other side. The bed blocking it began to slide across the floor, pushed by an invisible force. I backed away to the window with nowhere to run. The door burst open, ripped from its hinges, and crashed against the opposite wall. In the doorway stood her. But she was no longer the pale, sad apparition. Her form had become monstrous, a twisted figure of shadows and resentment. Her limbs elongated, her eyes two embers of pure hatred. She no longer tried to hide her true nature. "I don't need your help anymore," her voice echoed in my mind, a voice that was now a cacophony of rage and madness. "Now I just need you to hear me." The creature lunged at me, and as it did, the world around me dissolved into a whirlwind of sound and fury. The walls of my bedroom vanished, replaced by the vision of the night Daniel died. I saw their argument, her violence, his fear. I saw the blow, the blood, the silence, and I saw how she, consumed by her own poison, had died alone, her resentment so powerful it had chained her to that place forever. The entity didn't just want to kill me. It wanted me to be her witness, her confessor, her audience. It wanted my newly opened mind for sound to become the final receptacle for her story of hate. A story she was now telling me with unbearable clarity, dragging me with her into her personal hell. The room vanished, replaced by a whirlwind of images and sounds that didn't belong to me. I was trapped in her memory, a passenger on the night of her crime. I felt the cold metal of a knife in her hand, a dead, purposeful weight. The irrational fury growing in her chest wasn't just an emotion. It was a wave of heat that clouded the vision. I heard Daniel's pleas, not with my ears, but as vibrations of pure terror resonating in my bones. I saw Daniel's face, the man from the photo, his expression shifting from confusion to fear, and then to absolute terror. And I heard everything. I heard her own scream, a sound not of fear, but of rage. The dull thud, and the sudden, terrible silence that followed. A thick, almost liquid silence. The entity was forcing me to be her accomplice, to relive her sin over and over, using my newfound sense of hearing as her personal theater. Her goal wasn't to kill me. It was worse. She wanted to empty me of my own life and fill me with hers, to turn me into a vessel for her resentment, a living recorder that would play back her story of hate forever. I felt her cold consciousness exploring mine, digging into my most private memories, not just seeing them, but twisting them. She showed me moments of loneliness, of failure, amplifying the emotion, delighting in my fear, feeding on the novelty of my terror. I was a new experience for her, a virgin listener. But amidst that psychic assault, I clung to a single thought. The locket. It was on the floor, a few feet away from me, glowing with a dark light. It wasn't an anchor. It was a cage. And she wanted me to destroy it to free her completely. But it was also her nexus, the focal point of her power in this world. If her essence was tied to it, maybe I could use it against her. Fighting her hate with more hate was futile. She had been drowning in her own poison for decades. She was infinitely stronger than me on that ground. I had to do something she wouldn't expect. I couldn't fight the sound, but I, better than anyone in the world, understood its opposite. Silence. Not the expectant, ghost-filled silence of my apartment, but the pure, absolute, empty silence of my former life. My entire life had been training for this moment. I had learned to read the world in the vibrations of the floor, to find meaning in the absence of noise. My silence wasn't empty. It was a space I controlled. I could fill it or empty it at will. If the entity was a scream, I would become the void that absorbed it. The creature intensified her attack. The vision became unbearable, the sound of her crime replaying in an endless loop. I felt my own consciousness begin to fray, my memories mixing with hers. I was losing. And then, I did something that went against every survival instinct. I stopped fighting. I stopped resisting the visions. Instead, I focused on my implant, the channel of my torment. I remembered the first sound I had ever heard, the aggressive, meaningless buzz of the hospital fluorescent light. It wasn't a sound with emotion or history. It was pure, empty sound, a frequency without meaning. I clung to that memory. I focused on that buzz, brought it to the forefront of my mind, amplified it. As the entity bombarded me with the emotionally charged sounds of her crime, I responded with a wall of white noise, a sound without soul, without history, without anything she could feed on. The buzzing grew in my head, becoming a deafening static, a sound of pure nothingness that began to drown out her whispers, her screams, her pain. The entity seemed baffled, then enraged. Her psychic assault faltered but was replaced by a physical attack. The bedroom walls groaned. The last intact objects in the room began to vibrate violently on the surfaces, and a crack spread across the ceiling. She was trying to break my concentration with brute force, shaking my physical prison to shatter the mental one. The white noise I was generating held no emotion. It was the antidote to her poison of resentment. The figure of shadows and fury surrounding me began to flicker, to destabilize. The pure, meaningless sound was erasing her story, was undoing her existence based on the echo of an emotion. She let out a shriek of fury, a sound that was no longer just in my head but manifested in the room, making the window panes rattle. She tried to reassert control, but I didn't yield. I kept pushing with the buzzing, with the static, filling every corner of my mind with a sonic void. The figure began to contract, to fold in on itself. And as it did, I knew it was my only chance. Her essence, her power was being forced back, concentrating on her single anchor point, the locket. With the creature weakened, fighting against the tide of my self-imposed silence, I stood up. The room was still a chaos of floating objects and dancing shadows, but now I was the eye of the storm. The air grew thick as if resisting my movement. I grabbed the metal lamp from the nightstand, the only heavy, solid thing within reach. It felt incredibly heavy, as if the room itself were trying to prevent the blow. The entity, now reduced to a swirling mass of darkness concentrated around the locket lying on the floor, sensed my intention. The creature let out one last warning shriek in my mind, a promise of eternal pain if I dared, and the entire room shook as if a train were passing underneath. It lunged at me one last time, not to possess me, but to protect its cage, which was also its heart. I didn't give it time. I threw the lamp with all my strength. The metal hit the wooden floor next to the locket, but the force of the impact was enough to send it flying into the air. In a reflex action, I kicked it mid-air, like a soccer ball, sending it crashing against the wall. The impact didn't make the metallic sound I expected. There was a flash of black light and an implosion sound, as if all the noise in the universe had been concentrated into that small object and then snuffed out forever. A shockwave of absolute silence expanded through the room, and the figure of the woman let out one last mute scream, her form disintegrating, not into smoke, but into motes of silence that were absorbed into nothingness. And then, peace. The silence that fell over the apartment wasn't the silence of my old deafness. It was a clean, new silence. I could hear my own heartbeat, the soft murmur of the city far away. But the whispers, the laments, the resentment, they were gone. I stayed on the floor for a long time, shaking, exhausted, but alive. Free. Months have passed. I moved out of that apartment. I couldn't stay in a place with so many echoes. I live in a small house now with a garden. I've come to love the sounds of the world again. The singing of birds, the sound of the wind in the trees, music. My implant still works, but now I'm the one who controls what I hear. The experience changed me forever. I discovered a new world, the world of sound, only to find its worst monster within it. But it also made me understand something. The silence I had known my whole life wasn't a deficiency. It was a fortress, a place of peace I could always return to. I fought a creature made of sound and hate, and I defeated it not with more noise, but with a void, with the memory of the nothingness I knew so well. Sometimes to face the loudest ghosts you don't need a scream, but a silence so deep that nothing can grow in it. In that balance, between the sound of the world and the peace of my own inner silence, I have finally found my place. Pain has its own geography, a map of empty places and screaming silences. Seeking refuge from that devastated territory, I decided to lose myself on a real map, in a place where the vastness of nature could make my own sorrow insignificant. I chose a remote, primeval forest, a vast expanse of trees as ancient as time, a place famous for having no reliable maps. My goal, or the excuse I kept telling myself to justify my escape, was to find and photograph a legendary waterfall that, according to stories, was hidden in its heart. I trusted, with the naivety of someone with nothing left to lose, that the deep stillness of the woods could drown out the constant noise of my memories. Before venturing into the thicket, I spent the night in a small village that seemed to cling to the edge of the forest, as if afraid of being swallowed. In the only inn, a dark stone building with wooden beams, an old man with a deeply wrinkled face watched me as I spread my maps on a table. His eyes, clouded by age, seemed to see beyond the papers. He told me, in a voice that sounded like dry leaves rustled by the wind, that those maps were useless. He explained, while cleaning a glass with ceremonial slowness, that this forest wasn't made of earth and trees, but of memory. He assured me that it didn't follow the world's rules, that it remembered every footstep, every breath, and that it didn't like to be awakened. "You're not the first to come here hoping to get lost and find yourself," he stated, fixing his gaze on me. I thanked him for the advice with a polite smile, dismissing his words as local folklore designed to impress outsiders. My compass and my GPS, logic and technology, were the only guides I thought I needed. The next morning, at first light, I began my journey. The instant I set foot under the canopy, the world changed. The air became cold and damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth, moss, and the slow decay of centuries. The silence was almost absolute, a pressure in my ears, muffled by the carpet of dead leaves that yielded under my boots. I followed a barely visible trail, a scar on the ground that didn't appear on any of my guides but seemed to head in the right direction. For the first few hours, a sense of peace washed over me. The majesty of the trees, giants covered in a green mantle that filtered the sunlight into golden shafts, was a balm to my wounded soul. The solitude was clean, a solitude I had chosen. The first hint that the old man's words weren't just tales was subtle. After several hours of walking, I stopped to rest by a peculiar rock formation, 3 large boulders stacked and covered in a deep reddish moss. I took a photograph, storing it in my memory as a landmark, and continued on my way. I walked for at least another hour, maintaining a steady course north, confident in my progress. Then, I stopped dead. Ahead of me, blocking the path, stood the same formation of 3 red rocks. It felt impossible. The trail hadn't forked. I was sure I had always walked in a straight line. I told myself I must have unknowingly walked in a circle, frustrated by my apparent carelessness. I checked my compass. The needle trembled erratically, as if undecided, before settling back on an unstable north. I pushed forward, this time paying almost paranoid attention to my surroundings, leaving small marks on the tree trunks with my knife so I wouldn't get lost again. But the woods seemed to be playing with me. The landscape repeated itself with a maddening logic. A winding stream I had already crossed. A huge fallen tree blocking the path that I had to go around again. And once more, the 3 red rocks. Panic, a cold, tight knot, began to form in my stomach. I pulled the GPS from my pocket, my last hope. The screen flickered to life, but instead of a map, it displayed a message I had never seen on any device. Cannot determine location. Searching for signal. The signal never came. I was lost, but not in a normal way. I felt trapped in a labyrinth, in a loop designed by an invisible, twisted mind. I decided the most sensible thing was to retrace my steps, to try to return to the village. But when I turned around, my heart lurched. The path I had come by no longer existed. In its place stood an impenetrable wall of undergrowth and young trees that I didn't remember seeing. It was as if the forest, in a matter of minutes, had healed the wound of my passage, erasing my trail with terrifying efficiency. It was then that the feeling of being watched became almost physical. It wasn't the gaze of an animal. It was a pressure in the air, a silent attention emanating from the thousands of trees surrounding me. I stopped, holding my breath, and strained my ears. I didn't hear bird song or the buzz of insects, only the murmur of the wind through the leaves. But beneath that murmur I heard something else. A sound. A whisper that slithered between the trees and spoke my name. Eric. The utterance was so clear, so close, that I spun around, expecting to see someone hidden in the shadows. But there was no one. The echo had come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the forest itself had spoken to me. The sun began to set, and the shadows lengthened, becoming dark fingers stretching across the forest floor. The temperature dropped sharply. I had to find shelter for the night. As I desperately searched for a clearing, I began to notice movement. At first, I thought it was my eyes, tired and suggestible from panic. But no, when I wasn't looking directly at them, in my peripheral vision, the trees appeared to move. It wasn't the gentle sway caused by the wind. They shifted, slowly and imperceptibly, changing position like pieces on a chessboard, closing the few remaining open spaces, narrowing the world around me. I found a small hollow between the roots of an immense tree and decided to make camp there, though the word camp was too optimistic for my situation. I built a small fire, more for the sense of security the dancing flames provided than for the warmth. Night in the forest was total darkness, a blackness my small fire could barely keep at bay, and in that darkness, the voices returned. There were several, whispering my name from the thicket, sometimes from my left, sometimes from my right, sometimes from above me, as if they were hanging from the branches. They were echoes, fragments of conversations that seemed to ride on the wind. And then I heard a voice that chilled my blood and broke my soul. It was the voice of the person I had lost, the reason I was in that forest. "Eric, honey, I'm here. Come find me." I knew it was impossible. A part of me, the part still clinging to logic, screamed that it was a cruel hallucination, a trick of my own mind or of this cursed place. But another part, the part now dominant, the one broken by grief, whispered a terrible question. What if it isn't? What if you have one last chance? I stood up, flashlight in my trembling hand, and aimed it into the darkness where her voice had come from. I saw only the tangle of trees and undergrowth. But the voice came again, closer this time, tinged with an urgency that tore me apart. "I'm lost, Eric. Please help me." My rational mind screamed at me to stay by the fire, not to move, not to fall into the trap. But my heart, that desperate traitor, urged me to take a step, and then another. I ventured into the darkness, following the sound of my dearest memory, while the other voices of the woods whispered my name around me, like a chorus giving me a sinister welcome. The forest was hunting me, and I was willingly walking straight into its jaws. The fire from my makeshift camp became a smaller and smaller point of light behind me, an orange pupil that contracted until the darkness swallowed it completely. The cold, which it had previously kept at bay, now bit through my clothes. The only guide I had left was the voice, that painfully familiar melody floating just ahead of me, always just beyond the reach of my flashlight's trembling beam. I moved through an almost solid blackness, stumbling over roots that felt like claws emerging from the earth to trip me, while the branches of bushes scratched my face and clothes as if trying to hold me back. The air was frigid and smelled of disturbed earth, of the deep dampness of a grave. With every step I went deeper into the trap's bowels, and with every step, the fragile flame of hope battled against the gale of terror. The chorus of murmurs enveloping me grew denser, more intimate. They no longer just spoke my name. They began to utter fragments of my life, secrets no one else could know. I heard the last conversation I had with my father before he died, his exact words echoing among the trees. I heard the sound of the hospital monitor, the rhythmic beep just before it became a flat line. The forest didn't just know my name. It knew my history, my deepest wounds. It was a violation. I felt it rummaging through my memory, extracting my fears and longings to use them as bait. The voice imitating my loved one became more desperate, pleading, ensuring my bleeding heart prevented me from thinking clearly. The sensation that the trees were moving was no longer a peripheral suspicion, but a terrifying certainty. My flashlight beam would sometimes catch a slow, deliberate movement at the edge of the light. Trunks slid silently over the leafy ground, repositioning themselves in my path with a faint dragging sound, like that of a giant snake. It wasn't a natural movement. It was methodical, intelligent. The forest was thinking. It was herding me, guiding me toward a destination it had chosen, closing off any possible escape route behind me. I glanced back in a moment of lucidity and saw only a wall of tightly packed trunks, a prison of living wood growing around me. Panic was a bitter bile in my throat, but the call came again, and I, like an automaton, kept moving forward. I don't know how long I walked. It could have been minutes or hours. Time in that place had no meaning. It stretched and contracted like elastic. Finally, the calls led me to a small clearing. In the center stood a single tree, larger and older than any I had seen. Its branches twisted toward the night sky like the arms of a tortured giant, and its bark was so dark it seemed to absorb the light. The voice seemed to come from behind this wooden colossus. I approached, my heart pounding with a mix of terror and a demented hope that refused to die. As I rounded the thick trunk, the voice abruptly ceased. The silence that fell was deafening, and there on the ground was not the person I expected to find. Lying on the ground, My backpack. The same one I was wearing at that very moment. It lay open, my camera gear and meager supplies scattered around it. Beside it was a camera identical to mine. An icy shiver ran down my spine. I looked over my shoulder, patting my own back. My backpack was still there, securely fastened. With trembling hands, I picked up the camera from the ground. It was covered in mold and the screen was cracked, but the memory card seemed intact. I carefully removed it, my fingers clumsy from the cold and fear. I hesitated for an instant, a part of me begging me to throw it away and run, but the need to understand was stronger. After a moment that felt like an eternity, I inserted it into my own camera. The screen flickered to life, its artificial light a desecration in the clearing's darkness. The first images were mine, the ones I had taken earlier that day, the red rock formation, the winding stream. But then, there were other photographs, images I didn't remember taking. A photo of the trail vanishing behind me, a photo of the trees caught in mid-motion, their forms blurry and ghostly. And then, a series of self-portraits began. It was me, but it wasn't me. The man in the photos had my face, but he was gaunt, with several days' worth of beard growth and an expression of pure terror in his eyes. It was my face, but inhabited by a panic I hadn't yet reached. It was like seeing the ghost of my own future. I swiped through the photos with my thumb, feeling the air escape my lungs. In the last photo, the man who was me stood in this very clearing, next to this very tree, and behind him, in the darkness, a shape was discernible. A tall, skeletal figure, made of shadows and intertwined branches, with an impossible anatomy that defied logic and 2 points of pale light where eyes should be. A choked gasp escaped my lips. I dropped the camera. That wasn't my backpack. It wasn't my camera. It belonged to someone else. Someone who had been here before me. Someone who perhaps was also named Eric. Someone who had followed the sound of a loved one. Someone who had fallen into the exact same trap. The old man at the inn was right. The forest remembered. It remembered its victims and reused its lures. And then, the murmurs returned. But this time, they weren't uttering my name. They were singing. A chorus of dozens of voices, men, women, and children, rose around me. And I recognized the melody. It was the same lullaby my mother used to sing me to sleep when I was little. The sound came from everywhere, from the trees, from the ground, from the air. It was a lullaby for madness, a serenade for the damned. I looked around, terrified, sweeping the darkness with my flashlight, and I saw the eyes. Hundreds of pairs of pale eyes glowing in the undergrowth, in the hollows of the trunks, in the highest branches. The entire forest was watching me, and it was singing to me. I understood the terrible truth. I wasn't alone. I was in the most crowded place in the world, a place filled with everyone who had been lost before me. The forest didn't just remember, it collected souls. And I was its latest acquisition. The figure from the last photograph, that entity made of wood and shadows, slowly materialized from the trunk of the ancient tree. The bark cracked and split open with a sound like old bones breaking, and from the blackness within emerged the creature. It was taller than I had imagined, its long, thin limbs moving with an unnatural creak. It had no face, only those 2 points of cold, empty light that fixed on me. It was the guardian, the heart of the forest, the collector. I scrambled backward instinctively, tripping over a root. I fell hard on my back, the impact knocking the wind out of me. The chorus of voices sang louder, a wave of sound that made the ground and my own bones vibrate. The creature took a step toward me, and then another. The sound of its steps wasn't the sound of weight on leaves, but of old, dry wood cracking. Panic wasn't an emotion, it was a physical change. I felt the blood turn to ice in my veins, my muscles petrify, turning me into a statue of flesh about to be claimed by the landscape. The lullaby the voices sang twisted, becoming a dissonant funeral march, the soundtrack to my own absorption. My fate was the same as the man in the photographs. I would become another pair of pale eyes in the dark, another voice in the choir of the lost. My pain hadn't found a refuge, but a tomb, a living, conscious tomb that was now coming to claim me, and I no longer had the strength even to scream. The paralysis of terror was broken by the most primal of instincts, survival. As the forest creature, the collector of souls loomed over me, a spring released inside me. It was a spasm, a reflex act of pure denial against such a grotesque end. I rolled sideways, scrambling to my feet with desperate clumsiness. One of the creature's limbs, sharp as a stake, descended. It impaled the ground right where my head had been seconds before. The earth made a dull, wet sound. A smell of ancient rot filled the air. I didn't stop to think. I ran. No direction, no logic, driven solely by visceral panic. The macabre lullaby turned into a cacophonous roar of voices behind me, a wave of sound chasing me. I could hear the creaking of the creature moving through the trees, an unnatural sound of old, dry wood breaking at an impossible rhythm. Not the heavy tread of a beast, but the swift, silent scuttling of a giant spider. The forest, my prison, had become my hunter. Every tree, every shadow was an accomplice. The trees that had previously moved with imperceptible slowness now shifted with terrifying speed. They interposed themselves in my path, closing corridors that had been open a second before. Low branches became barriers striking my chest and face. The ground turned soft and muddy under my feet, trying to trap me. Roots rose like snares to trip me. It was an obstacle course designed by a malevolent intelligence, a cruel game whose only end was my capture. My flashlight lay back in the clearing. Now I was guided only by the pale, ghostly luminescence of the hundreds of eyes watching me from the darkness. They moved around me, maintaining a constant distance, like a silent, expectant audience awaiting the inevitable outcome. Each pair of eyes was a reminder of my fate, a trapped soul now participating in the hunt for the next. The voices also changed. They no longer sang. Now they spoke directly to me, with whispered threats. "You can't escape, Eric. Soon you'll be one of us." And among them, the pleading sound of my loved one. "Don't leave me here alone again. Please, stay with me." While running, my hand brushed against the camera hanging from my neck. I had instinctively picked it up from the ground just before fleeing. A crazy idea, a flash of pure desperation cut through my terrified mind. The flash, the light. If this thing was made of shadows in the darkness of the woods, maybe pure artificial light could harm it. It was a remote possibility, a gamble from a man with nothing left to lose. I stopped abruptly, spun around, aimed the camera into the darkness I was fleeing from. The collector was there just a few yards away, its silhouette outlined against the glow of the forest's eyes. I pressed the button. The flash exploded, blinding violence, flooded the thicket with sterile white light. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek, like 1,000 insects chirping in unison. It recoiled, shielding its non-existent eyes with its long branch-like limbs. Its form seemed to flicker, turning translucent for an instant. The chorus quieted for a moment, as if the light had affected them too. It worked. The light heard it. No time for relief. The flash's effect was momentary. The creature recovered almost instantly, its shriek turning into a growl of pure rage. But it had given me a chance, a minimal advantage. I ran again, this time with a purpose. Every few yards I turned, fired the flash, kept the beast at bay, bought precious seconds. It was a macabre dance, a tactical retreat in a nightmare. Flash, run, flash, run. The camera's battery, my only weapon, became my lifeline. The charge indicator blinked red. The forest intensified its attack. The ground opened beneath my feet, revealing dark chasms. Thick vines like ropes dropped from the branches trying to snare me. The very geometry of the place seemed to warp, paths twisting back on themselves, trying to return me to the central clearing, to the collector's nest. It was then that I saw it. Through a momentary gap between the dancing trees, I glimpsed a light that wasn't from the lost one's eyes. It was a faint, grayish light, different. The light of dawn, the edge of the forest. Salvation, hope, for the first time in hours, was more than just a poison. It became fuel. I ignored the pain in my lungs, the scratches covering my body, and ran toward that light with the last of my strength. The collector seemed to sense my intention. Its fury unleashed. The entire forest roared. Trees closed in around me, forming an almost solid wall. The creature lunged toward me, ignoring the flash's burst, determined to catch me before I reached the edge of its domain. I threw myself against the final barrier of undergrowth and young trunks, using my body as a battering ram. Branches tore at my skin, but adrenaline drowned the pain. And then, I stumbled and fell forward, rolling down a small slope covered in wet leaves. I felt an abrupt change, a jolt, as if passing through a curtain of icy water. When I stopped, the air was different. The smell of damp earth and decay had been replaced by the fresh scent of field grass. The chorus of voices had died away. The silence was no longer oppressive but natural, filled with the chirping of crickets and the distant song of an early bird. I turned around, panting, and looked back. I was out. Just a few feet from where I lay, the tree line stood like an impassable wall. In the gloom within, I saw the collector, motionless, watching me from the shadows. It couldn't cross the boundary. Its power ended where the normal world began. We stared at each other for a long moment. There was no anger in its presence, only a cold, patient certainty. Then, with deliberate slowness, it dissolved back into the shadows of the trees. The forest fell silent again. I dragged myself away from the edge until I felt safe. I lay on the damp grass, watching the sky turn from gray to pale blue, while my body trembled uncontrollably. I had escaped. I don't know how, but I had. I never found the waterfall. My camera gear, except for the shattered camera hanging from my neck, remained in that clearing, next to a backpack that wasn't mine. When I finally reached the village hours later, covered in blood and mud, the old man at the inn saw me enter. He asked no questions. He simply nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting my return, and served me a glass of water with steady hands. His gaze held no surprise, only a deep, ancient sorrow, the knowledge of all those who hadn't come back. I've come to understand that there are places in the world that operate by rules older than humanity. That forest wasn't just a collection of trees. It was an organism, a predatory consciousness that fed on grief and memory. I didn't go there looking for a waterfall, but for a place to forget my pain. Instead, I found a place that forgets nothing and ensures its victims don't either. Days later, I checked the memory card. The photos of the man who looked like me, the ones of the creature, were gone. Only mine from the beginning remained. The forest had even kept the proof. Sometimes at night, when the silence is very deep, I think I hear a murmur on the wind, the echo of a lullaby. And I know the forest is still there, waiting, remembering my name, collecting the stories of those who, like me, made the mistake of thinking they could lose themselves in it to find themselves, not knowing that the forest always finds you first. My world began when everyone else's ended. I worked the night shift, a solitary street sweeper tasked with cleaning up the remnants the city left behind each day. The streets, which were a chaos of noise and people during the day, transformed into my silent domain. I liked the night. I liked the solitude, the anonymous hum of the sodium streetlights, and the feeling of being a ghost, an invisible presence bringing order while the city slept. My route was always the same, a methodical circuit through the historic district with its narrow streets and stone buildings. The sound of my cart and the scraping of my broom against the pavement were the only soundtrack to my nocturnal existence. It wasn't an exciting life, but it was a peaceful one, a predictable routine in a world that had long stopped surprising me. The night everything changed began like any other. The air was cool, and the city was exhaling the last of the day's heat. I was cleaning a narrow, poorly lit alley, a pedestrian shortcut bustling during the day, but becoming a dark, silent throat at night. My broom pushed aside a pile of wet newspapers, and something appeared underneath. A wallet. Dark leather, worn from use. I picked it up. An almost automatic gesture, part of the unwritten code of the night folk. If you found something with an ID, you tried to return it. I opened it under a street lamp. No money. Credit card slots empty. Only one document remained, an ID card. I turned it over, and then the world turned upside down. The photograph was of me. Not recent, maybe 4 or 5 years old, but unmistakably me. My face, my hair, my eyes. I felt a strange mix of confusion and a pang of violated privacy. How did my photo end up in this wallet? I read the name, Victor. My name, last name, same as mine. But then my eyes fixed on the other details. The date of birth was different, just 1 day off from mine. And the address. A street on the other side of the city, an industrial neighborhood I'd never been to. An icy feeling ran down my spine. My mind grasped for a logical explanation. An impossible coincidence. A man identical to me with my name, living in the same city. Statistically absurd, but more plausible than any alternative. Or maybe it was a joke. A very elaborate and pointless one. Who would go to such trouble? I looked around. The alley was empty. Building windows were pits of blackness. I felt watched. With a sharp movement, I tossed the wallet and ID into my trash cart, onto the newspapers and debris. I tried to push the image out of my head, get back to my routine. But the image of my own face on an ID that wasn't mine stayed with me. A splinter lodged in my mind. The following nights, my perception of the city changed. The solitude that once comforted me now felt threatening. The empty streets no longer seemed peaceful, but expectant. I felt the weight of thousands of dark windows surrounding me. I started noticing things. A motionless figure behind a curtain on a 3rd floor. An office light abruptly switching off as I passed below. Before, I wouldn't have given them a second thought. Now, every small detail seemed like a sign, a confirmation I was being watched. The night's silence was no longer anonymous. It was filled with focused attention. Then the car appeared. A dark sedan, a common model. Nothing remarkable. The first time I saw it, it was parked on a wide street midway through my route. Didn't think much of it. But the next night it was there again on a different street further ahead, and the night after, another. Always on my route, always empty. Always parked in a way that forced me to pass right by it. I started changing my path, taking alternate streets, but the car kept appearing. Like a pawn moving across a chessboard, always anticipating my next move. My mind fought to stay sane. It's the lack of sleep, I told myself. The monotony of the night shift, the strange wallet coincidence got to me. I tried to cling to logic, but reality was fraying at the edges. One night, the phenomenon became undeniable. I'd spent nearly 2 hours sweeping and cleaning a small square, a patch of cobblestones with a dry fountain in the center. I left it spotless. Not a single cigarette butt, not a scrap of paper. I went to the adjacent street to empty a trash can, a task taking no more than 5 minutes. When I returned to the square to continue my way, I stopped dead. The square was covered in trash. Not normal nighttime litter. It looked like a crowd had just passed through. Dozens of cigarette butts, crumpled newspapers, food wrappers. 2 hours of work undone in 5 minutes without me hearing a thing. Impossible. I looked around, heart racing. The streets were deserted. No one. It was as if the city itself were mocking me, erasing my tracks, denying my very existence. Paranoia became my shadow. I began to doubt everything. My senses, my memory. Had I really cleaned the square? Had I really seen that car? The world was becoming unstable, and at the center of it all was the thought of that other Victor, the man with my face and name but a different life. I thought about him constantly. Did he really exist? Was he doing this to me? Was he trying to drive me crazy? Take my place? The idea was insane, but it lodged in my mind and began to grow. A week after finding the wallet, the final blow came. It was the quietest night I remembered. No wind, not even the distant murmur of traffic. I walked down a street lined with dark storefronts. The only sound was the squeak of my cart's wheels. The feeling of being watched was almost physical, a pressure on my back. I felt like an actor on an empty stage, knowing thousands of eyes watched from the dark theater. I passed a parked car. The instant my cart aligned with its door, the car alarm exploded with a deafening wail. Lights flashed, illuminating the street in strobing bursts. I jumped back, heart in my throat. The noise was an assault, a brutal violation of the night's quiet. I looked around, searching for the cause, for someone. No one. The street was empty. Then, my gaze fell on the storefront window of a clothing shop across the street. The dark glass acted as a mirror, reflecting the scene. Me. The car with its flashing lights. I saw my own reflection, a solitary, frightened figure in the middle of the street. But I wasn't alone. Behind my reflection, standing right on my heels on the deserted sidewalk, was another figure. It was me, wearing my same work clothes, same hair, same face. But his expression wasn't fear. It was empty, cold, a mask of indifference. It was the man from the ID photo, my other self. A choked cry escaped my lips. I spun on my heels, body tense, ready to confront my double, but no one was there. The sidewalk behind me was completely empty. The car alarm stopped as abruptly as it had started, plunging the street back into deep, unnatural stillness. I stood there in the middle of the street, staring at the empty space where a second before my other self, my replacement, had been. The question was no longer if I was going crazy. The question was if I was the real Victor. The silence following the alarm's cessation was more deafening than the blast itself. I stood in the middle of the street, heart pumping painfully hard, staring at the empty spot where my other self had been. The air smelled of ozone, of an electrical discharge. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't a hallucination. The solidity of his presence, the coldness of his vacant stare, were burned into my mind with the certainty of a wound. I abandoned my cart, my route, my job. I turned and ran aimlessly through the sleeping streets, needing only to get away from that storefront, that reflection, the irrefutable proof that my mind or my world had irrevocably broken. I didn't return to work for 3 days, called my supervisor, lied about a sudden fever, spent those 3 days locked in my apartment, a voluntary prisoner. But the feeling of being watched didn't disappear. In fact, it intensified. I felt the invisible eyes not just on the streets, but through the walls of my own home. I'd sit on the sofa, motionless for hours, listening to the clock tick, the fridge hum, any sound to anchor me to reality. But in the silence between sounds, I heard other things. The creak of a floorboard in the empty hallway, an indistinct whisper seeming to travel through the pipes. Paranoia became my only companion. I started seeing his face, my face everywhere. In crowds during the day, I'd think I saw a man in my same jacket disappear around a corner. My heart would lurch, the air turned cold, and when I reached the spot, only strangers. In the subway window reflection, his face superimposed on mine for a split second, smiling with a grimace not my own. The world had become a hall of mirrors, and in each, he waited for me. Evidence of his existence, or my madness, began seeping into my life's crevices. Mail started arriving for me that wasn't mine. Credit card bills I never applied for, bank statements from an account not mine. All addressed to Victor Garcia, my name, but with a slightly different middle initial or date of birth altered by a day like the ID. One morning a postcard arrived, a picture of a tropical beach I'd never visited. On the back, unfamiliar handwriting, "Wish you were here," signed with a name I didn't recognize. At first I thought bureaucratic errors, but the letters kept coming, weaving the reality of a parallel life tangling with mine. One afternoon, a phone call. A woman I didn't recognize asked for Victor. I said it was me. She started talking about a conversation we supposedly had yesterday, one I didn't remember, about a topic unknown to me. When I told her she was mistaken, we hadn't spoken, she got angry, accused me of playing games, and hung up. I stood holding the phone, trembling. He wasn't just watching me, he was interacting. He was living. My identity grew fragile. Who was I? Who was he? Were there two of us? Or only one? My mind split. One half living a life the other didn't recognize. The question tormented me, kept me from sleeping, thinking. I had to find the source, the wallet, the ID, the address. I'd tossed the wallet, but the address remained burned into my memory. Numbers and a street name sounding industrial, forgotten. I decided to find it. My only clue, my only chance to confront the source of my madness. Spent days in the library, when I should have been sleeping, consulting old city maps. The street wasn't on modern maps or navigation systems, a ghost street. Finally found it on a dusty 1970s map. Part of an old industrial zone mostly demolished for a new highway. The street, per the map, should be right at the demolition zone's edge. As my search obsession grew, the torment on my night shift became more personal. Had to go back to work. Needed the money, needed the routine not to fall apart completely. But my route wasn't a refuge anymore. It was his game board. He started leaving things. One night found one of my coffee mugs, one I used every morning, placed perfectly center on a deserted park bench miles from home. Another night, a book from my shelf lying mid-sidewalk. Messages. Telling me he could enter and leave my life at will. No lock could stop him. My safe space was gone. The city itself seemed against me. Streetlights flickered out as I passed, plunging me into sudden darkness. Alleys I'd crossed hundreds of times seemed to end in brick walls I didn't remember, getting lost on my own route, my own territory, the world rewriting itself around me to corner me. Finally, after a week's search, found the street from the ID. In a desolate area, a purgatory of abandoned warehouses and silent factories. The street barely a cracked asphalt path, lined by brick buildings with broken windows. And there, at the end, the number I sought. An old apartment building, about 5 stories, looking decrepit and abandoned. My heart pounded brutally. Knew I had to go in. If there was an answer, it was inside. The main door hung open, hinges broken. Inside smelled of damp and neglect. Went up the stairs, my steps raising dust clouds. Found the apartment. Door closed but wood rotten. Couple shoulder shoves, lock gave, door groaned open. Air from inside cold and stale. Turned on flashlight, aimed into darkness, and then all air left my lungs. Apartment furnished, an exact replica of mine. My sofa, springs burst, fabric rotting. My coffee table covered in a half-inch of dust. My bookshelf, same books, pages yellowed, stuck from damp. My life, seen through a filter of decades of neglect, decay. Apartment of a ghost. My ghost. Walked inside, horrified. Photos hung on walls. Photos of me, but with people I didn't know. Me, smiling on a beach beside unknown woman. Me at family celebration, surrounded by strange faces. The other Victor's life, one I hadn't lived. Approached bedroom wall, wedding photo. Me, younger, beside bride never seen. Background date, exact day I had serious car accident. Left me comatose a week, memory gaps. Monstrous, impossible thought formed. What really happened in that accident? What if I hadn't woken alone? What if man leaving hospital wasn't same one who entered? Standing there, mid-macabre reflection of my life, mind near shattering, heard sound. Not whisper, not knock. Real, close sound. Key turning in apartment front door lock, someone coming in, spun around paralyzed just as door began slowly swinging open. The sound of the key in the lock was the snap of a closing trap. I stood petrified in the middle of the room, a macabre museum of my own life. The knob turned with an agonizing slowness, and the door swung inward, revealing only the dark, silent hallway of the building. No one was there. I waited, holding my breath for my other self to walk in, but the hallway remained empty. An icy whisper that sounded disturbingly like my own voice seemed to slide from the darkness, saying, "Welcome home." And then, the door slammed shut with a thunderous violence that shook the entire apartment, plunging me back into darkness and dust. I ran to the door and pushed. It wouldn't move. It was locked, sealed like a tomb. I pounded the rotten wood with my fists, shouting, but the sound was absorbed by the thick silence of the abandoned building. I went to the windows. They were covered in a thick layer of grime. I tried to open one, but it was stuck, welded shut by rust and time. I grabbed a broken chair and smashed it against the glass. The wood of the chair splintered, but the glass didn't even crack. It was unnaturally strong. I was trapped in my ghost's apartment, in the physical proof of my own madness or of a conspiracy that was beyond my understanding. The hours that followed were a descent into the abyss. I walked through the rooms, touching the objects, my objects, covered in the shroud of time. The feeling of unreality was total. It was my life, but dead. I saw the armchair where I would sit to read, but its fabric was torn and smelled of mildew. I saw the table where I ate, but its surface was cracked and warped. It was like walking through my own future after my own death. I stopped in front of a mirror hanging on the hallway wall, its glass stained black with age. I expected to see his face looking back, but I only saw my own, gaunt and terrified. The paranoia reached its peak. Every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the building was him, my other self, moving in the walls, watching me, waiting. I went to the kitchen. It was a replica of mine, but the faucets were covered in rust and cobwebs hung from the cabinets. I opened a drawer, looking for something, anything, and inside, under a set of tarnished silverware, I found a yellowed envelope. It wasn't addressed to me, or was it? The recipient was Victor Garcia. My name, my address, the address of this abandoned apartment. The handwriting was a doctor's. With trembling fingers, I pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. It was a letter. I read it by the light of my flashlight. It wasn't from a friend. It was a psychiatrist's report. It described the condition of his patient, Victor Garcia. It spoke of a severe cranial trauma after a traffic accident. It spoke of partial amnesia, and it spoke of a diagnosis. Capgras syndrome, a condition in which the patient believes a close person has been replaced by an identical imposter. But the report described an extremely rare and complex variant. The patient didn't believe a loved one was an imposter. He believed that he himself had been replaced. The letter detailed how the patient, Victor, had become convinced that an exact double was trying to steal his life. It described how he had started receiving mail from his supposed double, how he received calls intended for him. The doctor explained that these were all self-delusions, constructs of a fractured mind trying to make sense of the gaps in his memory and the feeling of alienation from himself after the trauma. The wallet, the calls, the mail, all were fabrications or misinterpretations of random events, magnified by paranoia. And then, I read the last paragraph, the one that changed everything. The patient has begun to build a nest for his delusion. He has found an abandoned apartment and is furnishing it with objects he collects from the trash, creating a decaying replica of his own home. It is the place where he believes his imposter lives, a physical stage for his psychosis. He visits it in dissociative states, often at night, without being fully aware of his actions. His night shift job in the void of the sleeping city acts as a powerful catalyst for his delusion, giving him the space and the silence for his paranoid narrative to flourish without the interruptions of daytime reality. We must consider hospitalization before he becomes completely lost in the narrative he has created. The letter fell from my hands. The cold I felt wasn't supernatural. It was the cold of the truth, a truth far more terrible than any ghost. There was no double. There was no conspiracy. There was only me. My broken mind. The man who walked out of the hospital after the accident wasn't a replacement. It was me, but damaged, incomplete. And my brain, in its desperate attempt to explain the void, had invented a monster, and it had given it my own face. The instant the truth settled in my mind, the pressure in the room disappeared. The feeling of being watched vanished. But as I read, paranoia made one last desperate attempt to survive. A voice in my head, the voice of my double, whispered to me, "It's a trap. The letter is fake. He left it to confuse you. They want you to think you're crazy so they can trap you." For a moment, I clung to that idea. It was easier to believe in an external enemy than an internal one. It was easier to be the victim of a conspiracy than the author of my own madness. The idea of being sick was a loneliness far deeper than that of being hunted. If there was a double, then I was real. If there wasn't, then I wasn't sure what I was. But the cold, terrible logic of the letter was stronger. Everything fit. My nocturnal wanderings, the feeling of being erased. I wasn't being erased. I was erasing my own tracks in a state I wasn't aware of. It was replaced by a different, more intimate and lonely horror, the horror of confronting oneself. I sat on the dusty floor, surrounded by the trash I myself had collected to build the lair of my imaginary enemy, and I cried. I cried for the man I thought was chasing me, who was myself. I cried for the years of self-imposed loneliness and fear. I stood up and walked to the door. I turned the knob. It was open. It had never been locked. The only lock had been in my mind. I walked out of the apartment and down the stairs. I stepped out of the building and the morning sunlight blinded me. The world seemed strangely normal, noisy, and indifferent. I stood there on the sidewalk of that ghost street, a man who had just witnessed the death of his own ghost. Months have passed. I don't work the night shift anymore. The solitude of the empty streets is no longer a comfort. Now I seek out noise, crowds, the constant validation that the world I see is the same one everyone else sees. I'm in therapy. Dr. Vega is helping me put the pieces back together. She tells me the other Victor was a way for my mind to give form to my fears, my loneliness, the feeling of not being the same after the accident. I got a day job in a warehouse. The constant noise of the machinery and the voices of my co-workers are a balm. They are proof that I'm not alone in my head. I haven't had any more hallucinations. I haven't seen his face in any reflection. But sometimes, on very stressful days, I feel an echo of that paranoia, a fleeting doubt. Am I really alone? The fight isn't over. It's a silent battle I wage every day. What I've come to realize is that sometimes madness isn't an abyss you fall into. It's a labyrinth you build yourself, brick by brick, to protect yourself from a truth that's too painful. And the most terrifying monster isn't the one that stalks you in the darkness. It's the one that looks back at you from the mirror, with your own face, waiting for you to let your guard down so it can take control. The other shift, the one spent on watch against yourself, never truly ends. Hope is a slow poison, one that keeps you searching long after logic tells you to stop. It had been 6 months since my sister Flora disappeared. 6 months of official silence, of police reports leading nowhere, of sleepless nights staring at her photo. Flora was an environmental journalist, stubborn, passionate, and with a dangerous tendency to stick her nose where it didn't belong. Her last trace vanished near the edge of the Oakhaven abandoned industrial zone, a wasteland of rusted smokestacks and ruined buildings that had been cordoned off for decades after a chemical disaster no one wanted to remember. The official story was that she got lost, that she succumbed to the dangers of the unstable terrain. I didn't believe it. Flora was too smart, too prepared. Someone or something had silenced her. I ignored the no trespassing signs, the rusted fences, and the chemical hazard warnings. I cut through the chain-link fence with bolt cutters and ventured into the forbidden zone. The air changed instantly. It became heavy, metallic, with an acrid smell that irritated my throat. The silence here wasn't natural. It was the silence of a dead place, where not even birds dared to sing. The landscape was a post-industrial nightmare. Brick buildings with broken windows, metal structures twisted like prehistoric skeletons, and everywhere, a blackish, oily sludge oozing from the cracked earth. Nature was trying to reclaim the place, but it was a sick nature. Stunted trees with deformed leaves, puddles of water with an unnatural, iridescent sheen. Everything looked diseased, contaminated to the core. My only clue was the last email Flora had sent me. It was cryptic. She spoke of biological anomalies, of contamination that went beyond the chemical. She mentioned a specific location, Building 7, the heart of the old chemical complex, where she believed she would find definitive proof of criminal negligence. My plan was simple: get to Building 7, look for any trace of her, and get out before the place's toxicity affected me. I wore a gas mask and a makeshift protective suit, and I carried a Geiger counter that emitted a soft, constant clicking, reminding me that every second I spent there was a risk. I walked for hours through that labyrinth of ruins. The Geiger counter sometimes spiked near the sludge puddles or rusted barrels bearing faded biohazard symbols. The desolation was total. I saw no signs of animal life, not even insects. Only the wind whistling through the broken structures, creating sounds that sometimes resembled whispers. The first sign I wasn't alone wasn't visual or auditory. It was the smell. The acrid chemical odor suddenly mingled with another scent, an organic, fetid stench, the smell of decaying flesh. It came from an abandoned warehouse whose metal door was ajar. I approached cautiously, flashlight in hand. The interior was dim, filled with rusted machinery, and in the center was something that made me recoil, choking back bile. It was the carcass of a deer, or what was left of it. It was horribly deformed. Its body was bloated, covered in greenish pustules that seemed to ooze. One of its front legs had branched into 2 bony appendages, and its head. Its head was twisted at an impossible angle, and a grayish, pulsating mass hung from its open snout. It wasn't a sick animal. It was an abomination. I backed out of the warehouse, my stomach churning. The chemical disaster hadn't just poisoned the land. It had twisted life itself. It had created something new and monstrous. I continued on my way, now with a new layer of fear clinging to my skin. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows lengthened, turning the ruins into an even more sinister landscape. I had to find Building 7 before nightfall. I found it at the end of an avenue of cracked asphalt. It was an imposing structure, a cathedral of concrete and rusted metal, with a central smokestack rising toward the sky like an accusing finger. The main entrance was sealed, but I found a side entrance, a metal door ripped from its hinges. The interior was a maze of dark corridors, looted laboratories, and large rooms of silent machinery. The air here was even heavier, and the clicking of my Geiger counter was constant, though not alarming. I looked for any sign of Flora, a piece of her clothing, her journalist's tools, anything. It was in one of the old administrative offices that I found the first trace. On an overturned metal desk lay a notebook. It was hers. I recognized her cramped, urgent handwriting. The last few pages were filled with frantic notes. She wrote about water samples with impossible toxicity levels, about mutations in the local flora, and she wrote about something else, something that moved in the night, something not animal. Silent observers, she wrote, pale figures in the periphery, too fast to photograph, too quiet to record. What are they? My heart pounded. Flora hadn't just discovered the contamination. She had found the inhabitants of this hell. I kept exploring, now with desperate urgency. In a lab filled with broken flasks and smashed equipment, I found her camera. It was on the floor, partially crushed, as if someone had deliberately stomped on it. The memory card was missing. The sun had set. Darkness flooded the building. I switched on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the blackness. I knew I should leave, wait until morning. But the thought of leaving Flora there, perhaps injured, perhaps alive, was unbearable. I had to keep searching. That's when I heard the first sound. A wet, organic, clicking sound coming from the hallway behind me. I spun around, aiming the flashlight. The hallway was empty, but the sound repeated closer this time, and then another and another approaching rapidly. It wasn't the sound of footsteps. It was the sound of something crawling, something with too many legs, moving at an unnatural speed along the walls or ceiling. I backed away slowly, my back against the wall, sweeping the flashlight beam down the corridor. The sound stopped just around the corner. A tense silence fell over the building. I waited, holding my breath. And then, a dark, segmented shape slowly peeked around the corner. It was low, reptilian, with multiple limbs ending in sharp claws. Its body seemed covered in the same black, oily sludge I had seen outside. It had no visible eyes, but I felt its attention fixed on me. It opened jaws that dripped a dark fluid and emitted a high-pitched hiss that hurt my ears. I turned and ran blindly through the dark hallways, the sound of its multiple legs chasing me, getting closer. I heard it overturn furniture in its path, smash through doors. It wasn't just a mutated animal. There was intelligence in its pursuit, a deliberate cruelty. In my panic, I stumbled into a large control room filled with panels of broken instruments. There was no exit. I was cornered. I turned, flashlight trembling, awaiting the final attack. The creature entered the room, its silhouette framed against the gloom of the hallway. It was larger than it had seemed, almost the size of a wolf, but with the wrong shape of a bloated insect. It stopped a few yards from me, tilting what must have been its head, studying me. And then, behind it, another appeared, and another. In seconds, I was surrounded by half a dozen of them. They didn't attack. They simply watched me, their bodies motionless, their jaws clicking softly, the air filled with their fetid odor. I realized they didn't want to kill me, at least, not yet. They were waiting for something, or someone. And as I stood there paralyzed by terror, surrounded by those abominations born of poison, a new, cold, and terrible certainty washed over me. They hadn't hunted me by accident. They had been waiting for me. And Flora's disappearance hadn't been the end of her story. It had only been the beginning of mine. The circle of creatures closed slowly around me. Their multiple limbs clicked against the broken concrete floor, an organic, wet sound mingling with the low hiss emanating from their deformed bodies. My flashlight beam reflected off their oily skin, revealing grotesque textures, fusions of chitin and swollen flesh, pustules that seemed to pulse with an internal greenish light. They were the personification of disease, nature twisted into a predatory form. I stood motionless, waiting for the attack, but it didn't come. They simply watched me with unnatural patience, as if I were a piece on a board whose turn had not yet come. The stench was unbearable, a mix of decay and the acrid chemicals that permeated the entire building. It was hard to breathe inside the gas mask, and panic threatened to choke me. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there waiting for them to decide to devour me. My gaze swept the control room, searching for an escape, an improvised weapon, smashed control panels, cables hanging from the ceiling, overturned chairs. Nothing useful. Then my flashlight illuminated something on one of the walls, a metal door, small and low, like one for a maintenance duct. It was rusted but seemed intact. It was my only chance. Without a second thought, I lunged for it. The creatures reacted instantly, their expectant stillness shattered. With surprising speed for their deformed bodies, they converged on me. I dodged the first one, feeling the brush of one of its claws on my protective suit. Another cut me off, its jaws snapping inches from my leg. I vaulted over a fallen console and ran for the metal door. I reached it and yanked the rusted handle. It didn't budge. It was stuck. I heard the creatures closing in behind me, the sound of their multiple legs scraping on the concrete. I slammed my shoulder against the door, desperate. It gave way with a metallic screech, and I tumbled inside, falling face down into a narrow, dark space. I turned and pulled the door shut, just as the first creature reached the threshold. The heavy door slammed closed with a metallic thud, cleanly severing one of its limbs, which writhed on the floor beside me before dissolving into a pool of black sludge. I was safe, at least for the moment. I was in a narrow maintenance tunnel, barely wide enough to crawl through. It smelled of rusted metal and the same rot that permeated the rest of the building. I turned on my flashlight. The tunnel seemed to stretch into the darkness. I had no idea where it led, but anywhere was better than the control room. I started crawling, pushing my backpack ahead of me. The space was claustrophobic. The sounds from outside faded, replaced by the echo of my own breathing inside the mask and the scrape of my body against the metal walls. I crawled for what felt like hours, turning blind corners, climbing rusted ladders. The tunnel was a labyrinth within the labyrinth of Building 7. Finally, I saw a light at the end. I reached a metal grate that opened into another room. I peered through it. It was a laboratory, different from the ones I had seen. It was strangely clean, almost untouched. There were stainless steel tables, relatively modern lab equipment, and on one wall, a whiteboard covered in complex chemical formulas and biological diagrams. And on one of the tables was a pile of papers and a voice recorder. I forced the grate open and climbed into the lab. I took off my gas mask with relief. The air here was strangely clean, filtered somehow. I approached the table. The papers were research notes. The handwriting was Flora's. My heart leaped. She was alive. Or at least, she had been until recently. The notes described what she had found. Not just the chemical contamination, but its effects. She wrote about an unknown catalyst in the original spills, something that didn't just poison but actively rewrote the genetic code of exposed organisms. She spoke of an accelerated, aberrant evolution, and she spoke of the creatures. She called them the spawn. She wrote that they weren't simple mutants. They seemed to have a kind of collective intelligence, a hive mind centered on something, a source. I picked up the voice recorder. It was labeled Final Note. I pressed play with trembling hands. Flora's voice filled the silence. She sounded tired, scared, but also strangely excited. "I'm close," her voice said. I found the source. It wasn't just the chemistry. There was something else. A fungus, a symbiotic parasite that thrives in the toxicity. I think Varro, the original chief engineer, had known about it. He had been studying it. The creatures, the spawn, seemed to protect it. And the worst part, I think it can infect humans. I've been exposed. I feel changes. I can't leave. I have to document this. If anyone finds this, know it wasn't an accident. It's a new form of life. Terrible, but life. Terry, if this is you, get out of here. Forget about me. Save yourself. The recording ended with a click. I stared at the device, paralyzed. Flora hadn't just discovered the creatures. She was infected. She was transforming, and she had decided to stay. A new kind of despair washed over me. It wasn't about finding and rescuing her anymore. It was about finding her before it was too late. Before she became one of those things. Or maybe she already was. I checked her last notes, searching for any clue to her location. I found a crude map of Building 7 she had drawn herself. She had marked several areas as dangerous, spawn nests, and there was a single point marked with a red circle and one word: incubator. It was on the lowest level of the building, in the subterranean chemical processing chambers. I knew what I had to do. I had to go down there. I had to find her. And I had to face whatever I found. I left the lab and looked for stairs leading down. The building seemed to grow darker and more organic as I descended. The concrete walls were covered in a blackish, pulsating biomass. The air grew warmer, humid, and smelled of fermentation. I heard constant sounds around me, clicks, gurgles, the movement of large things in the darkness. The spawn were everywhere. I had to move stealthily, using the shadows, holding my breath whenever I heard one nearby. Several times I had to hide in rusted lockers or behind broken machinery as one of the creatures crawled past, its grotesque silhouette barely visible in the gloom. Finally, I reached the lowest level. It was an immense cavern, excavated beneath the building. Large chemical processing tanks, now broken and leaking their toxic contents, filled the space. And in the center, illuminated by a strange, greenish bioluminescent glow, was the incubator. It wasn't a machine. It was a gigantic organic structure, a sort of pulsating cocoon made of the same biomass that covered the walls, but translucent. It stood at least 30 feet tall, and inside, floating in a greenish amniotic fluid, I could see shapes. Humanoid shapes, but twisted, in the process of changing. They were like monstrous chrysalises. I approached, horrified and fascinated. I counted at least a dozen forms inside. They were the missing, the unlucky ones who had wandered into the zone over the years. And Flora. She was there. I recognized her instantly, despite the distortion of the fluid and the changes that had already begun to manifest in her body. She floated motionless, eyes closed, connected to the cocoon by a network of dark tubules. She was alive. But for how long? As I stared at her, desperate, looking for a way to free her, I sensed a presence behind me. I turned slowly. It wasn't one of the crawling spawn. It was different. It was tall, humanoid, but its body was covered in the same dark, chitinous armor as the other creatures. Its face was a featureless mask with multiple red eyes that glowed in the dark, and in one of its deformed hands, it held something. The memory card from Flora's camera. It wasn't just a spawn. It was something more. A guardian. Or perhaps Varro himself, the engineer, transformed by his own creation. The creature held up the memory card and then pointed toward the cocoon where Flora floated. And in my mind, I heard a voice. Cold, metallic, emotionless. She is next, and you are the witness. It hadn't come to kill me. It had come to make me watch, to document the birth of its new toxic era. The humanoid figure watched me with its multiple red eyes, its posture strangely calm amidst the biological hell. It held the memory card like a trophy, proof of its victory over Flora, and now over me. The horror of the situation paralyzed me for an instant. It didn't just intend to transform my sister. It wanted me to witness it, to document its horrible triumph. It was a cruelty beyond simple predation. It was vanity. My fear transformed into an icy fury. I hadn't come this far to be a spectator. I looked at Flora, floating in the greenish liquid of the cocoon. Her face was serene, but her skin already showed the first signs of mutation. An unnatural pallor, dark veins showing beneath the surface. I had to get her out of there. I broke eye contact with the guardian creature and ran toward the incubator. The surface of the cocoon was taut and rubbery to the touch, hot, like reptile skin. I looked for a way to open it, a weak spot. The dark tubules connecting Flora to the central structure seemed to be the key. If I could cut them, maybe I could free her. I pulled out my hunting knife, the only weapon I had left. The instant the blade touched one of the tubules, the guardian creature reacted. It moved with blinding speed, crossing the distance between us in a blink. It struck me in the chest with brutal force, throwing me backward. I slammed against one of the rusted metal tanks and fell to the floor, gasping for air. The guardian positioned itself between me and the incubator, its red eyes fixed on me. It spoke again in my mind, this time with a note of warning. The process must not be interrupted. The biomass must adapt, it is the law. I pushed myself up, aching. I knew I couldn't beat it in a direct confrontation. It was too strong, too fast. I had to find another way. My gaze swept the subterranean cavern, the chemical processing tanks, the toxic sludge covering the floor, the incubator itself pulsing with biological energy. I remembered Flora's notes, an unknown catalyst, a parasitic fungus thriving in toxicity. Maybe the key wasn't to fight the creatures, but the environment that had created them. While the guardian watched me, expecting my next futile move, I noticed the pipes entering and leaving the base of the incubator. They must be the feeding system, pumping the chemicals that nourish the transformation process. One of the main pipes, thicker than the rest, had a manual control valve, red and rusted. It was a long shot, madness. But I had nothing to lose. I pretended to stumble, falling near the incubator's base out of the guardian's direct line of sight. It remained motionless, underestimating me. With my last strength, I crawled to the valve. It was stuck fast with rust and corrosion. I grabbed the red wheel with both hands and pulled with all my might. For an instant, it didn't move. Then, with an agonized screech of tortured metal, the valve began to turn. A roar filled the cavern. The main pipe vibrated violently. I had shut off the primary flow of chemical nutrients to the incubator. The reaction was immediate. The cocoon's bioluminescent glow began to flicker. The amniotic fluid inside churned, bubbling. The humanoid forms floating within started to convulse, and the incubator itself emitted a sound, a low, deep groan like that of a wounded beast. The guardian turned toward the incubator, its red eyes blinking with something that looked like alarm. Forgetting me for a moment, it approached the cocoon, touching its pulsating surface as if trying to soothe it. I seized its distraction. I ran to the other side of the cavern, looking for something, anything I could use. My eyes landed on a rusted control panel on one of the walls connected to the tank's old pumping systems. Most of the buttons were broken, but a red lever labeled emergency drain seemed intact. It was a desperate gamble. I didn't know what the tanks contained or where they would drain. But anything was better than letting the incubator keep functioning. I pulled the lever down. A metallic groan echoed through the cavern, and the drain pumps miraculously sputtered to life with a rusty roar. From the bases of the enormous tanks, a torrent of thick, blackish chemical sludge began pouring onto the cavern floor. The level of the toxic liquid rose quickly, covering my ankles, then my knees. The smell was unbearable, burning my eyes even through my protective goggles. The incubator reacted to the chemical change. Its groan became a high-pitched shriek. The convulsions of the forms inside grew violent, and the guardian, realizing what I had done, turned toward me, its body vibrating with pure rage. It lunged at me through the rising sludge, but the thick liquid hampered its movements. I dodged its first attack, sinking waist-deep in the chemical muck. My protective suit burned where it had torn. As I struggled to stay afloat, I saw the incubator begin to collapse. The translucent membrane ruptured, releasing the greenish fluid and the half-formed figures into the black sludge. Most sank lifelessly, but one of them moved. It was Flora. She opened her eyes. They weren't her eyes. They were completely black, without pupils. She looked at me, but there was no recognition in her gaze, only a hungry void. And then she began to swim awkwardly toward me, her movements uncoordinated, but with a clear predatory intent. I was trapped. In front of me, the furious guardian. Behind me, my own sister, transformed into one of those things. The sludge was rising. It was already at my chest. I was going to die there, drowned in poison or devoured by my own blood. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the other figures released from the incubator, a half-formed creature latched onto the guardian's leg. It swatted it away violently, but another grabbed its arm, and another. The failed abominations, freed from their prison, were turning on their creator in a final, blind agony. The guardian roared, fighting off the creatures swarming around it, slowly sinking into the sludge under their combined weight. Its attention was no longer on me. I looked at Flora. She was still advancing toward me, her black eyes fixed on mine. Love, sisterhood, all that had been erased. Only hunger remained. I knew I couldn't save her. What was left of her was no longer my sister. Heartbroken, I turned and swam toward the only exit I could see, a raised drainage duct in one of the walls where the chemical sludge was beginning to overflow. I climbed onto some broken machinery and pulled myself into the dark tunnel, just as I heard the guardian let out one last, choked roar before being swallowed by the muck in its own creations. I crawled through the duct for an eternity, the toxic sludge burning my skin, the sound of the cavern collapsing behind me. Finally, the tunnel opened outside, into a contaminated stream far from Building 7. I stumbled out, vomiting the poison I had swallowed, and collapsed on the bank. I had survived. But at what cost? I had found Flora, only to lose her in the worst way possible. I had destroyed the incubator, but I knew it wasn't the end. Things still breathed in the ruins of Oak Haven. I walked away from the industrial zone that same night, a solitary figure covered in sludge and despair. I never reported what I saw. No one would believe me. And perhaps it was better that way. Some toxic legacies are best left buried. My search began with the hope of finding my sister. It ended with the certainty that some quests lead you to places from which you never fully return. The contamination of Oak Haven wasn't just in the ground. It was in me. And I knew that somehow I would always carry the echo of that place with me, the shadow of the transformation that almost consumed me, the memory of my sister's black eyes looking at me without recognition. There are poisons that don't kill the body, but the soul, and I had breathed too deeply in the heart of one of them. Fatigue is a fog that clings to the mind, blurring the edges of reality. I had been driving for almost 12 straight hours, an endless journey along back roads winding through desolate landscapes. My destination was a remote town where I hoped to start over, leave behind a life that had fallen apart. The car was old, my only valuable possession, and its engine hummed with a hypnotic monotony that, combined with the exhaustion, kept me in a state of conscious drowsiness. Night had fallen hours ago, a moonless void under an overcast sky. The only real world was the cone of light from my headlights cutting through the darkness, and the dashed white line slipping under the wheels like an infinite snake. I was in the middle of nowhere. It had been over an hour since I'd seen another car, house lights, or even a road sign. Just the road and the oppressive darkness pressing against the windows. I rolled down the window, hoping the cool night air would clear my head. It smelled of dry earth and the distant promise of rain. The tiredness was a physical weight on my eyelids. I knew I should pull over and take a nap on the shoulder. But a part of me, eager to arrive, to leave the past behind, pushed me to keep going, mile after mile. That's when the lights appeared. They weren't headlights from another car. They were in the sky, right above me. Several lights, an intense bluish white, arranged in a geometric formation, a perfect triangle. They all pulsed together, with a slow, steady rhythm, illuminating the road and the surrounding landscape with a cold, spectral light that cast no shadows. I slammed on the brakes, hard enough that the tires screeched on the asphalt. I stared upward, mouth open, unable to process what I was seeing. There was no sound, just the pulsing light and the absolute silence of the surroundings. I felt a wave of disorientation, a sudden vertigo that made me grip the steering wheel. The air inside the car became strangely thick, heavy, like before an electrical storm, and then a low drone. The sound, almost inaudible yet physical, intensified, seeming to originate in my very bones and spread outward. It vibrated in the steering wheel, the dashboard, the seat. The car's lights flickered erratically and then died. The engine sputtered out with a final metallic sigh. Darkness swallowed me for an instant, broken only by the pulsing light from above. I felt an immense pressure, as if submerged deep underwater. My vision blurred. The drone filled my head, drowning out all thought. And then, nothing. An absolute void. Darkness. Silence. The next thing I knew was the sound of the car radio. An old song crackling with static. I opened my eyes. Dawn was painting the horizon in shades of orange. I was still in my car, hands gripping the wheel. The engine was running, I was driving. I blinked, confused. Where was I? How? I checked the rearview mirror. The road stretched empty behind me. No sign of the lights. I pulled over onto the shoulder, my heart pounding violently. What had happened? Had I fallen asleep at the wheel? Had I dreamed the whole thing? But the memory was too vivid, too real. The drone, the pressure, the void. I looked at the dashboard clock. It read 6:15 a.m. The last time I had checked it before seeing the lights, it was just after 2. 4 hours had passed. 4 hours I had absolutely no memory of. I tried to reconstruct the last moments before the void, the pulsing lights, the engine dying, the drone, nothing else. How had the car started again? How had I kept driving for 4 hours without being aware of it? The thought terrified me. I checked my body, looking for any marks, any injuries. Found nothing. Just a strange metallic aftertaste in my mouth. I looked around. The landscape was different. The dry hills had given way to green fields. In the distance, I saw the silhouette of a town. I consulted the map. I was nearly 200 miles from where I thought I had stopped. Impossible. I couldn't have driven that distance unconsciously, asleep. I turned the key off before stepping out. My legs trembled. I walked around the vehicle, looking for any sign, any damage. The car seemed intact, but then my gaze fell on the front windshield. Etched into the inside of the glass was a mark. It was a small geometric symbol, similar to what I had seen in the sky. A triangle of 3 circles connected by thin lines, almost like the flat projection of something three-dimensional. It was a small, discrete mark, easy to overlook, but it was there, impossible to erase. I got back into the car, feeling a wave of nausea. Something had happened during those 4 lost hours. Something inexplicable. Something that had left its signature on the glass. I started the engine again, this time driving slowly, all senses on high alert, scanning the sky, the fields, anything out of the ordinary. But the world seemed to have returned to its indifferent routine. I reached the town a couple of hours later. It was a small, quiet place, the kind of spot where I hoped to start over. I rented a small furnished house on the outskirts and spent the first few days trying to forget the experience on the road, convincing myself it had been a mix of extreme exhaustion and a vivid hallucination. The symbol on the windshield? Maybe it had always been there and I'd just never noticed. But forgetting didn't come. Instead, the drone returned. It started subtly, a few days after I arrived. A sound similar to what I'd heard in the car, but much fainter. I'd hear it in the silence of the night when everything was calm. At first I thought it was an appliance, the fridge, the water heater. But the sound had no clear source. It seemed to be in the air, or worse, inside my own head. Only I could hear it. I asked my landlord, a kind old man, if he heard any strange noises at night. He looked at me like I was crazy. The sound started affecting the electronics in the house. The radio would turn itself on, emitting only static. The TV signal would pixelate and lose sound intermittently. My new cell phone, which I'd bought upon arrival, would sometimes restart for no reason, or the battery would drain in minutes. Small glitches, technological annoyances, but they happened too frequently to be coincidental, and they seemed to intensify when the drone was louder. The paranoia I had tried to keep at bay returned with renewed force. I felt like I was under a microscope. The feeling of being watched came back, but it was no longer vague. It was specific, localized. I felt a presence in the house, something invisible moving around me, studying me. Sometimes upon entering a room, I'd feel a change in temperature, a sudden cold that vanished instantly. Or I'd find objects slightly moved. A book on the floor, a chair turned a few inches. One night I was sitting on the back porch, looking out at the darkness of the countryside. The drone was particularly intense. And then I saw them again. The lights. They weren't above me this time. They were far away, on the horizon, over the hills. It was the same triangular formation, the same bluish-white light, pulsing slowly. They stayed there motionless for almost half an hour, watching me, or maybe just waiting. And then they accelerated skyward and disappeared. There was no more room for doubt. It hadn't been a hallucination. This was real, and it wasn't over. The encounter on the road wasn't an isolated event. It was the beginning of something. They had found me. They had marked me. And now, they were watching me. The cycle had begun, and I had no idea what the next step would be, or how much time I had left before they came back for me. The sight of the triangular lights on the night horizon, a silent repetition of my encounter on the road, shattered the last barrier of my denial. I could no longer cling to the idea of exhaustion or suggestion. Something had found me. Something had marked me. And now, something was observing me from a distance, reminding me that the encounter hadn't been an end, but a beginning. The initial calm I had sought in the town evaporated, replaced by a constant anxiety, a feeling of being trapped in a countdown whose end I didn't know. My life became a besieged fortress. I reinforced the locks on the house, covered the windows with thick curtains. Every unexpected sound, the rustle of a branch outside, the engine of a distant car, made me jump. The low-frequency drone became more persistent, a constant companion in my head that rose and fell in intensity without warning. Sometimes it was so loud I felt my teeth vibrate. Other times it would disappear completely, leaving me in a tense silence, wondering if its absence was a truce or the prelude to something worse. The electronic glitches became stranger, more personal. My laptop, which I used to look for work and stay connected to the outside world, began to malfunction in unsettling ways. Sometimes, the cursor would move on its own across the screen, tracing geometric patterns similar to the symbol on my windshield. Other times, I would find new files on my desktop, empty text documents with names made up of seemingly random strings of numbers. One night I left the laptop on while I went to the kitchen. When I returned, the screen displayed a single sentence typed in a word processor. "We see you." I deleted the sentence with trembling hands, shut down the computer, and didn't turn it on again. Technology was no longer a tool. It had become a channel for my invisible stalker. The sense of presence in the house became more physical. It wasn't just temperature changes or the feeling of being watched anymore. I started finding objects that weren't mine. A small metal screw made of an unknown material appeared on my pillow. A thin, silvery filament, like a metal hair, was found tangled in my toothbrush. They were small, cold objects to the touch, seemingly left deliberately, like samples or perhaps territorial markings. The isolation deepened. I avoided leaving the house except when absolutely necessary. The few interactions I had with the townspeople became tense. I felt they looked at me strangely, with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Did they notice something about me? Could they see the invisible mark I felt I was carrying? Or perhaps it was just my paranoia, projecting my fears onto their indifferent faces. I began to document everything. I kept a detailed journal, noting every electronic malfunction, every strange object found, every sighting of the lights, every fluctuation of the drone in my head. I needed proof, even if only for myself, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. I needed to find a pattern, a logic in the chaos. And the pattern emerged. The phenomena weren't constant. They followed a cycle. For several days, everything would seem to return to normal. The drone would disappear. The devices would work. The sense of presence would fade. I would start to breathe again, to believe maybe it was all over. And then, without warning, the cycle would restart. The hum would return, stronger. The lights would appear in the night sky. And another episode of missing time would occur. The second episode was shorter, but more terrifying. I was taking a walk in the fields at sunset, trying to clear my head. I remember the smell of dry grass and the sound of crickets. I remember stopping to look at a strange cloud formation, and then, nothing. I woke up lying face down in the same field, but it was pitch black. The sky was covered in stars. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. This time, when I got back to the house, I found a new symbol etched into the glass of my kitchen window. It was different from the one on the car, more complex, like a connection diagram. And that night, the drone was deafening. I realized the nature of the cycle. Each episode of Missing Time was an intervention, a session, and each time, something changed. They left me a new mark, or altered something in my environment, or perhaps something inside me. It wasn't a violent, sudden abduction. It was a gradual, methodical process, a preparation. But for what? The question consumed me. I began researching obsessively, looking for similar cases, theories about abductions, about contact. I read stories from people who had experienced similar phenomena, the missing time, the strange marks, the invisible surveillance. Many spoke of a purpose, of a genetic experiment, of cryptic messages, but nothing quite fit my experience. The feeling I had wasn't of being studied by alien scientists. It was something colder, more impersonal. It was the feeling of being a piece in a mechanism, a component being adjusted for an unknown function. The isolation and fear began to take a toll on my sanity. Sometimes I doubted my own memories. Had I really seen the lights? Had I really lost time? The constant drone in my head created a mental fog that made clear thinking difficult. I'd look in the mirror and my own face seemed alien, gaunt, with eyes reflecting a panic I struggled to hide. I needed to talk to someone. I needed an outside perspective. But who could I turn to? Going to the police with a story about lights in the sky and missing time would only earn me a visit from social services. My old friends were far away, and our relationship had cooled after my recent divorce. I was completely alone. One night, while reviewing my journal, a desperate idea crossed my mind. If this was a cycle, maybe it was predictable. I noted the dates of my 2 missing time episodes, the initial encounter on the road and the one in the field. And I noted the dates of the light sightings. There was a pattern. They occurred roughly every 11 days. I calculated the date of the next event. It would be in 4 days. The idea terrified and excited me in equal measure. If I knew when they were coming back, maybe I could prepare. Maybe I could confront them, or at least get irrefutable proof. I decided to return to the site of the first encounter, to that desolate stretch of road. It was madness. It was like willingly walking into the predator's cage. But the need for answers was stronger than the fear. If I was going to be a piece in their game, I would at least try to understand the rules. The next 4 days were an agonizing wait. Every night I scanned the sky, waiting to see the lights. Every morning I woke up feeling the drone was a little louder, the presence a little closer. On the designated day, I packed a backpack with water, food, a powerful flashlight, my journal, and an old analog video camera I had bought secondhand, hoping it would be less susceptible to electronic interference. At sunset, I drove to the exact spot on the road where it had all begun. I parked the car on the shoulder and waited. Night fell, as dark and silent as I remembered. Hours passed. Nothing. Just the vast emptiness of the night landscape. I began to doubt. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe there was no cycle. Or maybe it was all just a product of my broken mind. And then the humming began. Faint at first, but rapidly growing in intensity. The car's lights flickered and died. The engine stopped. And in the sky, directly above me, the lights returned. The triangle of bluish-white lights, pulsing slowly. I pulled out the video camera and started recording, my hand shaking so much the image jumped. The lights descended slowly, silently, until they hovered about 100 yards above the road. They were huge, and they weren't just lights. I could make out a dark structure behind them, an impossible geometric shape that seemed to absorb the starlight. The pressure in the air increased. I felt the same vertigo, the same disorientation. It became clear what was coming next. The missing time, the intervention. But this time, I was ready. I held onto the camera, forced myself to keep my eyes open, to record, to resist. A light, brighter than the others, detached from the craft and descended toward me. It wasn't a beam. It was like a solid spotlight of white light. It enveloped me. The drone became a deafening roar in my head. My vision fragmented. I saw disconnected images, strange gray faces with large black eyes, metallic corridors, symbols I didn't understand. I felt an icy cold and the touch of something sharp and metallic on my arm. And then, the void. I woke up with a start, sitting behind the wheel of my car. The engine was running. The radio was playing. I looked at the clock. 2 hours had passed. But this time, I remembered fragments. I remembered the faces, the cold, the prick in my arm. I looked at my forearm. There, right where I had felt the prick, was a new mark. It wasn't geometric. It was a small triangular scar, as if a tissue sample had been taken. And the video camera. It was still on the passenger seat. I picked it up with trembling hands. It was on. The screen was black, but the time counter showed it had been recording for 2 hours. I rewound the tape to the beginning. I pressed play. The image was pure static, a whirlwind of black and white snow. But underneath the static, barely audible, was a sound, an unnatural heartbeat, slow, heavy, and superimposed on the beat, a voice, or something like a voice. Clicks, whistles, a rhythmic sequence that sounded like a language, a message. The tape ended. I stared at the black screen, listening to the ghostly beat that seemed to linger in the car's air. It wasn't an experiment. It wasn't observation. It was communication. And I was the unwilling recipient of a message I couldn't understand, but which I felt, with terrifying certainty, held the key to my own destiny. I listened to the recording over and over, sitting on the shoulder of that desolate road as the sun lazily climbed the horizon. The static, the unnatural heartbeat, and that rhythmic sequence of clicks and whistles. It was a message, I was sure. But it was a message in a language no human knew. I felt like an archaeologist before an indecipherable inscription, knowing it held the key to everything but having no Rosetta Stone to translate it. The frustration was immense, but so was a strange new determination. I was no longer just a passive victim. I was a witness, and I had proof, however ambiguous. I returned to town, the drone in my head now accompanied by the mental echo of that pulse and those clicks. I locked myself in the house and devoted myself to analyzing the recording. I used audio editing software on my cheap new laptop, filtering the static, isolating frequencies. I discovered mathematical patterns in the sequence of clicks, complex repetitions suggesting syntax. The heartbeat, I discovered with horror, wasn't a single beat. It was two superimposed heartbeats, slightly out of sync, creating a discordant pulse. Days turned into weeks. My life shrank to listening to that recording, trying to decipher it. I drew the sound patterns, compared them to mathematical structures, to ancient programming languages. I was going mad, I knew it, but I felt I was close to something. The 11-day cycle was approaching again. I understood they would be back, and I needed to be ready. The drone in my head intensified as the date neared. The phenomena in the house returned with greater force. One night, I woke to find all the furniture in my bedroom stacked in the center, forming a grotesque totem pole. Another night, the tap water ran black and thick for several minutes before clearing. The invisible presence was no longer subtle. It was playing with me, showing its power, reminding me my time was running out. And then, 2 days before the next predicted cycle, I found something. Not in the recording, but in my own fragmented memory of the last intervention. I remembered the prick in my arm, the metallic cold. I remembered seeing for a split second a symbol on the wall of that strange room where I found myself. It was the same triangular symbol etched into my car's windshield. A terrible idea began to form. What if the mark wasn't just a signature? What if it was an antenna, a receiver? What if the message on the recording wasn't for me, but that I was the medium through which it was transmitted? On the night of the 11th day, I didn't go back to the road. I stayed in the house. I knew it didn't matter where I was. They would come to me. I set up the video camera again, pointing toward the window facing the open fields. And I waited. The humming began at dusk, louder than ever. The lights in the house flickered and died. My laptop battery instantly drained. Only the video camera remained, running on its own battery. Outside, in the gloom, the lights re-emerged. The bluish-white triangle, floating silently over the hills. But this time something was different. The lights didn't descend toward the house. They stayed there, pulsing. And the drone in my head changed. It became the unsynchronized heartbeat from the recording, and the clicks and whistles began to sound not from a speaker but from inside my own skull, broadcasting outward. My body began to vibrate. The triangular mark on my arm, the scar, began to burn, glowing with a pale light beneath my skin. I realized with absolute horror my function. I was the beacon. I was the transmitter. The cycle wasn't preparation to take me. It was calibration. They were using me to send a signal, a message, across space or time. And each cycle they adjusted me, fine-tuned me, like an instrument. For what? To whom? As I stood there, paralyzed, vibrating like a human tuning fork, I saw something move outside the window. Not the lights. Something on the ground, crawling from the edge of the woods toward my house. Dark, low figures with multiple limbs. Creatures not of this world, drawn by the signal I was emitting. The message wasn't for them. I was the bait. Panic broke my paralysis. I had to stop the transmission. I had to turn myself off. I ran to the bathroom, rummaged through the medicine cabinet. I found a bottle of strong sleeping pills a doctor had prescribed months ago. It was my only option. Interrupt the signal even temporarily. I swallowed a handful of pills, far more than the recommended dose. I felt the pulse in my head begin to slow, the burning in my arm subside. The lights outside flickered and went out. The connection was breaking. I heard the creatures screech in frustration in the darkness outside. And then, I fell into unconsciousness. I woke up in a hospital bed. The fluorescent light overhead drilled into my eyes. A doctor explained that my landlord had found me unconscious on the floor of the house after not hearing from me for 2 days. Accidental overdose of sleeping pills was the official diagnosis. I spent a week in the hospital. The humming was gone. The mark on my arm had completely vanished. The lights didn't return. The cycle was broken. I thought it was over. I thought I had won. They discharged me. I went back to the house to gather my things. I couldn't keep living there. As I packed my few belongings, I found the video camera. I'd completely forgotten about it. With a mixture of dread and curiosity, I turned it on and rewound the tape. The recording showed the dark window, then the lights appearing in the sky. It showed my own tense figure vibrating, and then it showed the creatures crawling toward the house. But the recording didn't end when I lost consciousness. It continued. I watched as the creatures reached the house, surrounding the building. I watched as the lights in the sky descended again, this time very close. And I watched as a beam of white light shot out from the craft and hit the house. But it didn't destroy it. It scanned it. The beam focused on the window where I was, illuminating my fallen body on the floor. And then I saw my own unconscious figure. And I saw something else. Something floating above me. A geometric shape. A three-dimensional version of the symbol. A tetrahedron of light. It rotated slowly above my body. And then, it descended and merged with me, disappearing beneath my skin. The recording didn't just show an implant. It showed a transfer. A download. The recording ended. I stared at the black screen, a cold deeper than any fear I had felt before settling in. The cycle hadn't broken. It had just changed phase. They hadn't been using me as a transmitter. They had been preparing me. They had been emptying me, calibrating me, to turn me into something else. The mark wasn't an antenna. It was the installation site, and now it was inside me. I walked out of the house, leaving the camera, the journal, everything behind. I drove aimlessly, away from that town, away from that road. But I knew I couldn't escape. It wasn't about lights in the sky or missing time anymore. The anomaly was with me. It was me. I live a normal life now. I have a job, a new apartment. No one notices anything strange about me. But I feel it. Sometimes at night, I feel a faint vibration in my bones. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see geometric patterns of light. And sometimes, I feel like I'm not alone in my own head. There's something else, something cold, silent, and patient, waiting. I don't know what it is or what it wants. I only know it's part of me now, and that the anomalous cycle isn't over. It's just waiting for the right time to continue. Some contacts don't leave scars on your skin, but in your soul. Some abductions don't take you to the stars, but to a much deeper prison, the one you carry inside yourself.